Let me move now to one of the elephants in the room, namely climate change. How is that going to affect the global food situation? Well, first of all, there are basically three ways that climate change can affect the food system. Increasing temperatures, increasing greenhouse gas concentration, and increasing volatility in weather patterns. The last one, of course, you are very, very familiar with. If we look first at the temperature increase, that will increase rainfall, it would increase evaporation, and it will increase situations of heat maxima. These things will influence a number of factors, particularly in agriculture: soil moisture, water management, the animal and plant health, and insect attacks, and so on. This is probably more detail than you care to have, but there is a lot of discussion, I know, in this country and certainly in the country where I reside about what climate change is really going to do to the food system. In fact, let me rectify what I just said. In the United States, there's very little discussion about that. There ought to be a lot of discussion about it. The policymakers seem to have their priorities elsewhere at this point. Coming from Denmark, it was very disappointing to see what happened, or rather what didn't happen in December at the climate summit. But I know this country is very, very concerned about these things. At least that's what I've been told. So the climate change, of course, will influence the production system as well as the marketing system, and that has implications for what needs to be done, which, of course, I will talk about in a few minutes. In the short run, what we really need to worry about from a food systems perspective, insofar as climate change is concerned, in the short run, we should really worry a lot more about volatility in weather patterns, because that is going to create increasing fluctuations in food prices. And I'm going to say at the end that I think the long-term trend in real food prices is going to be down, not up. But the fluctuations in food prices will be much more severe in the future, partly because of the climate change, as shown here. And I don't have to go through this in this country with droughts, flooding, strong winds, and so on. These things, of course, would influence the food system. Now, I want to say a little bit about how the climate change may influence the food system, and we really don't know. I'm going to show four patterns and one is probably about as likely as the other. The first one is kind of, I call it a slow change, but maybe more like a continuous change. We can kind of predict that next year it's going to be a little worse and so on. That is a little easier to handle than this one. This one is more an exponential thing. Yeah, we're doing fine right now, so we don't really have to do something until that graph starts taking off, and then it may be a bit late to take action. This is something that policymakers ought to take a very close look at, and they should take a very close look at the step changes as well. We may be doing fine, and then suddenly there's a major change, and then we're doing fine for a period of time. And I'm talking, whether I'm talking about the impact on water availability, on soils, or whatever impact climate change will have on the food system, we don't really know whether, in fact, we are moving towards a tipping point. And that, of course, is the most dangerous of all. We do very little because it's not really so bad. We can do it sometime tomorrow or the next day, and suddenly you hit the tipping point. Do I know which of these represent what's actually going to happen? No, I have no idea. Does anybody else? I don't believe so. And this is the real concern, that we really don't know whether we are on one or the other of these four patterns. Now, I've been talking about climate change affecting the food system, but of course the food system affects climate change, and I'm looking particularly at agriculture here, where with an increasing forest cover, you can actually capture greenhouse gases. Increasing livestock production will do the exact opposite, and I'll come back and talk about that. Cropping patterns can change, soil management can change, and these things will have an influence on climate change. So it's a two-way causal relationship that we're looking at. So let me look a little more at the second set of relationships, namely the impact of agriculture on climate change. The estimates that I've seen show that somewhere around 15 to 20%, I'm showing 13 to 18, who knows, but it's probably somewhere in those magnitudes. Agriculture contributes to greenhouse gas emission. Probably, let's say, somewhere a little less than 1/5 of all the greenhouse gas emission comes from agriculture. It comes from land conservation, from methane, from cattle and manure, from burning timber, from rice production, and from fertilizer use. So agriculture is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emission. That's something we need to keep in mind. As I said earlier, I'm not a vegetarian. I have nothing against animals or meat consumption, or for that matter, consumption of dairy products. But if you look at the greenhouse gas emission per kilogram of food item, meat is way ahead of anything else, as you can see on this one. That's the bottom bar, shows that meat is so far ahead of the other foods. The other thing that we have to worry, and this is a particular one is for beef, and the other thing we need to worry about is what impact would the choice of production system have on water use, because we are going to be short on water, partly because of climate change, but partly for other reasons, because of very inefficient use of water. And again, if you look all the way to the left, you see that beef is accountable for many more liters of water used per kilogram of product. Now, it may be unfair to compare a kg of beef to a kg of maize, because obviously nutrient content is very different. But nevertheless, the point is that if we're serious about reducing greenhouse gas emission from agriculture, we got to find a way of reducing the emission that comes from livestock production. Now, so what am I suggesting? Well, this is, again, probably more detailed than you care to have, but I'm sure the PowerPoint presentation can be made available if you want to look at more details. But basically, I'm going to suggest 4 sets of activities that need to be done by developing countries themselves with our support. I think it's important that we keep in mind that it's not our responsibility in Australia or Denmark or the United States to make sure that everybody gets enough to eat. It's our responsibility to help developing countries make that happen, and at least not to stand in the way of their action. First, developing countries need to make huge investments in infrastructure, roads, institutions, domestic markets, irrigation canals, and so on. They meet, and I'm talking about feeder roads, because I think it's important that we don't think in terms of 4-laned highways for African rural areas. Many of the poor African farmers have no access to roads. They have to carry what they want to sell and what they want to buy. They have to carry it on their back, often for many kilometers. Feeder roads would be a way of putting in maybe a bicycle path, maybe a narrow road, so that they can use other means of transportation. If you really want to be optimistic, you're going to put in a road so that they can actually get a truck into the villages and into the area, the farming area. Those kinds of things have to be paid for by the government, because the private sector can't capture the benefits. The benefits go to societies. The society has to pay for it. The same is true for many of the other things I'm talking about here. Market information can to some extent be done by the private sector. Water management infrastructure, most of that has to be done by the public sector as well. Certainly primary education, primary healthcare. So a set of issues that I call infrastructure development that would have to be put in place. And let me give you one illustration of how bad the situation is in some countries. In some countries, the institutions to enforce contracts are not available. Measures and standards are not agreed upon. Governments don't enforce those things. How would you like to sit in Sydney and buy a pile of cassava in Malawi in Africa without knowing what the quality of the cassava is, without knowing how big the pile is, without knowing whether the contract can be enforced, and so on. Those kinds of things that we take for granted in Australia, Denmark, and the United States and many other countries are sometimes absent. Because we went through a period of time when we advised developing countries that less government was better government. So get governments out of your life kind of thing and let the private sector do the job. Well, let me tell you, for the private sector to do its job, the government has to do its job. And in many of those countries, the governments are failing to do what economists call investment in public goods and the kinds of things I've been talking about. So without those investments, the private sector just can't operate. And I'm not talking just about multinational corporations. I'm talking about the farmers themselves. They are part of the private sector. I'm talking about the local trader that buys 5 bags of maize and tries to transport it and sell it again. That part of the private sector can't work without these investments. Secondly, developing countries, with almost no exception, are under-investing in agricultural research. They are not using science to solve the food problems or the impending food problems. And I'm suggesting that many countries should double the investment in agricultural research. Now, whether it's a doubling or a tripling depends on the country. Some of that research will be done by the private sector, but again, much of this research has to be done by the public sector for 2 reasons. One, the private sector can't capture the benefits. It falls into the category of a public good. And the reason for that is that you can't take patent out on some of the research results, and you can't exclude anybody from using it, and therefore you can't charge for it, and therefore you can't justify making the investment. But society gains, and therefore society can justify making the investments, and that means the government on behalf of society would have to make those investments. That's one reason, the public goods argument. The other reason is that poor farmers may not have access to capital or credit, to their own capital or credit, so they can actually buy the technology that would be produced by the private sector. The private sector has to worry about whether there's a market for what they produce. If you put a research program in place that's going to take you 10, 15 years before you get the output, you better have a good market analysis that tells you that 10 to 15 years from now, these farmers are going to be able to buy your technology, your new crop variety, your drought-tolerant maize variety, whatever it is. Because if there is no market for that, the private corporations can't justify making the investment. So the government has to step in. Public-private partnership is the way to go in many situations. But right now the debate is much more on the extremes. Should it be the private sector or should it be the public sector? Isn't the private sector exploiting the small farmer? And should the public sector really spend taxpayer money on that? We need to have a much more enlightened debate where we look at the specific roles for the private and the public sector and how we can work together. And just to answer the question that somebody should be asking in the Q&A, am I affiliated with any of these private agribusiness corporations that produce technology for agriculture? Absolutely not. Do I have any financial interest in any of these corporations? Absolutely not, just to make absolutely clear on that. I was asked that question in one of the radio interviews today, and I think it's an excellent question. Priority area number 3. I have already talked a bit about this. We need policy incentives so that the private sector can do its job. And that means savings and credit institutions, and it means risk management tools for farmers. I have already talked about one source of risk, namely climate change. There are other sources of risk. Let me mention one other, namely the market risk. As countries move closer to self-sufficiency, they are increasing the risks in the international market, the risks of policy, of price changes, because they're basically taking themselves out of sharing in the risk management in the international market. So governments have to help making sure that the risk management tools are in place both for farmers and for others in the food system, so that that can work. Public goods investments I have talked enough about, I believe. Suggested priority area number 4, and this is probably the most controversial, I suspect, or maybe GMOs are still very controversial. It seems that way based on the interviews I had today. I don't quite understand why we keep talking about it rather than doing it, but that's another story. We need to continue to remove trade distortions in agriculture. This is something that this country has been trying very, very hard and has made some headway in reducing trade distortions for food and agriculture in the EU and the US, but there is a long way to go. We need regulation of the land grabbing. Right now, millions of small farmers are faced with the risk of losing their land because the governments are entering into agreements, into contracts with other governments over the heads of the small farmer. That is something that requires not just best practices, but actually some regulations that will keep that will protect the small farmers, poor rural people. We need clarity on water and land tenure. One of the reasons that we are suffering an increasing water scarcity is that the tenure is very unclear. To whom does the water belong? In some religions, the water belongs to God, and God distributes it for free. In other situations, it's different, but it's not clear who actually owns the water, or whether the water should be collectively owned, and if so, how should we assure that the scarcity value of water is being represented in the price that people pay for using it. And I'm talking primarily about agriculture, of course. And then what is really controversial, I think, is what I call the full costing. And it seems to me that if we are going to achieve the goal of sustainable food systems, meaning that we don't do damage to natural resources that future generations are going to have to pay for, then we have to charge the cost. We have to include the cost of the damage that we are doing to natural resources into the production costs, pass those costs on to the consumer. Now, in principle, for a university professor sitting in a nice armchair, that's no problem. We can dream this up in no time. Practicing it and putting it in place, of course, is virtually impossible unless we can get to an international agreement. Because one country, whether it's mine or yours, cannot put in place a system that suddenly makes the producers less competitive because they have to pay for the damage they do to natural resources. On the other hand, if we don't put in place a system like that, the whole argument about sustainability falls by the wayside, because we will continue to produce food and to handle food in an unsustainable way until such time that we have no choice but to deal with it. So the full costing is a principle that is very, very difficult to implement unless we can come to an agreement at the international level. And since we couldn't come to an agreement on something much easier in Copenhagen, I don't have a lot of hope that we can come to an agreement on this for some time to come. I want to raise one other point, and that is economists. Those of you who had Economics 101 will know that we are taught from the very beginning that trade-offs are the rules of the game. You can get this, but then you have to give up that. You can't spend your money twice, and so on and so forth. I'm arguing that in the real world there are lots of multiple wins. out there that are not being exploited. And let me just, or utilized is, I guess, a kinder word. And let me just give you one example. Suppose that a low-income farmer who is removing more nutrients from the soil than she's putting back into the soil, and therefore over a period of time is going to reduce productivity and therefore increase poverty. Suppose that farmer had access to more organic matter or fertilizer to maintain or increase the soil fertility, something I'm sure Pedro Sanchez will talk about next week. Then the farmer would produce more food and would earn more money or feed the family better. So you have multiple wins. You got reduced poverty, you got increased food production, and you protect the environment in the process. Now, yes, there has to be an input from somewhere, whether that's advice in better production methods, or it's subsidies of fertilizer, or it's investment in infrastructure. But once that input has forthcome, you don't have the trade-off that we talk about so much between increasing income and protecting the environment. And certainly in my country, there is a general agreement that if you want to earn more money, if you want to change anything that increases national income or personal income, it's going to be at the expense of the environment. And I'm arguing that in many developing countries, particularly in rural areas, it doesn't have to be that way. And this illustrates this trade-off that I've been talking about that's kind of generally accepted, that as income goes up, you do more damage to natural resources, up until a point when you either become rich or you become well-educated, and then you decide to deal with the environmental problems that you cause. China, in a sense, has followed that curve, and it's not at the top yet, I don't think. So they keep pushing economic growth to a considerable extent at the expense of the environment. At some future point, they're probably going to reach the top of that graph and say, wait a minute, we got to start dealing with the environmental disaster that we created, even if it means reducing economic growth, and then there would be on the other side of that curve. We don't know when that's going to happen, but I don't believe they're there yet. Now, here's what I'm arguing. I'm arguing that if you look at the left part, what we call stage one, that's where you have the triple wins. You can actually help farmers, in this case, or help poor people increase their income by producing more food in a way that's sustainable in the management of natural resources. And that stage one is very hard to find in the literature. Very few people have looked at that because we've kind of assumed that there has to be a trade-off. If you want this, you have to give up that. And I'm beginning to repeat myself, so I won't continue down that line, but simply to say that we need to look much more at stage one. Why can't we have sustainable management of natural resources at the same time as we increase food production and help people out of poverty? Of course we can. That's a triple win right there. Are we doing it? No, we're not. Because we still think that the world looks like this. There are a few other things there I want to mention. And if you notice, the stage 2 and stage 3 basically represent this graph. The top graph is just a repetition of that. What we have seen over the last 20 to 30 years is a reduction in a fall in this graph, in the sense that countries come to the conclusion they need to do something about the environment earlier on at lower levels of natural resource degradation. And we think that's because of additional knowledge. So yes, the graph is still going up, but they will start dealing with it before it reaches the heights that it would reach before. Maybe not at lower income levels, but at lower levels of degradation. Now, if we can all agree internationally to put in full costing so that in fact the damage we do to natural resources, which is now free, will in fact be costed out so that we're going to have to pay for it. And if that money is being used to remedy the damage that's still being done, and that's a big if, because we can probably get governments to put a green tax in place or whatever measure they choose, but can we also get them to earmark that money for natural resource management? So we got a couple of problems to deal with there. But suppose that's the case, we could get the bottom graph, meaning basically sustainability. And this, it seems to me, is what we all talk about, and there are, I think, ways of getting there. So this is my last slide, future perspectives. We have seen farmers respond as we expected they would to higher food prices by producing more. As I think I mentioned already, we're producing more food this year than we did last year, and last year I believe it was more than there was a year before. In any case, during the last 2 or 3 years, we had major increases in food production. We see an increase in the land grabbing that I talked about. I think that's going to go on for a while. I'm not quite sure what the outcome of that is going to be. And the most controversial point that I'm making here, probably for most people, is contrary to what the doomsayers are arguing. I believe that the long-term trend for real food prices, that is, the food price adjusted for inflation, is falling. It's not going to fall dramatically like I showed you for the 80s, but it is going to fall. And that goes against the apocalypse prophets' argument that food prices are going to continue to go up. It's very interesting. When the food prices, during the 2007, beginning in 2008, when the food prices were going up, as I showed you, there were a number of people that wrote in blogs and newspaper articles, and a few books managed to get out real quick, that said that that's just the beginning, that the food prices are going to continue to go up at that same rate. And it's very interesting that every time there's a short-term change in something, we project that short-term change into the future as though it was a long-term trend. We somehow got to keep these things separate if we want to be reasonable in our policy recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to see increasing price volatility. I'm quite sure about that, partly because of climate change and partly because of the movement towards self-sufficiency in some countries that I mentioned earlier. The link between oil and food prices will also contribute to the increasing fluctuations in food prices, because we can probably expect fluctuations in oil prices, even though they've been fairly stable the last few months. There are two reasons why we see this strong link. One, of course, is the biofuel link that we talked about. If oil prices go up, it will be profitable to take resources out of food production and put it into biofuel production. The other reason is that production costs go up because farmers are using oil in the production process. My sad prognosis or perspective is that I think governments are going to continue to focus on urban areas rather than rural areas. And of course, that is what they have been doing, and the reason, one of the outcomes has been that a lot of the rural poor have moved into urban areas, and poverty, of course, moves with them. So to the extent that governments would solve these problems in rural areas, you would have a more reasonable outmigration. Yes, outmigration from rural to urban areas is part of development. It's going to happen. The question is the speed. If that outmigration would correspond more or less to the employment creation in urban areas, these countries would be much better off. And then my worst fear is that governments are going to go back to complacency like they had up until a few years ago, basically saying, look, we're doing fine, thank you very much. Food prices are now stable or maybe slightly falling, so now we don't have to do anything. That would be a disastrous outcome. But policymakers are policymakers, and I suspect that is one possible outcome. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I'll be delighted to try to answer any questions you may have.